Good afternoon. My name is Mark Anders, and I'm the head of the .NET Frameworks team. And today I'm going to be walking you through one of the very important pieces of that framework, Active Server Pages Plus. Now, as you probably know if you attended some of the general sessions yesterday, Active Server Pages Plus plays a very important role in not only building UI, but in building things like web services. It really forms the entire web application model, which is a really important part of the .NET platform. And so what I'm going to be doing today is walking you through the various pieces. In many ways, the name Active Server Pages is a little misleading and doesn't really fully describe everything it does because it does play such an important part. So I'm going to start by reviewing many of the aspects of Active Server Pages today, both sort of the good aspects and the things that we wanted to improve. Then I'm going to be taking you through the three main areas of Active Server Pages Plus: the pages and UI controls, writing web services, and something that we haven't really talked much about in the general sessions, and that is the application infrastructure, things like deployment, configuration system, the flexible security system, and also the lowest level, which are the HTTP handlers and modules. So I think of the first slide sort of as ASP the good. These were sort of, as we looked at ASP as it exists today, some of the really cool things about it and some of the stuff that we really want to maintain in that new Active Server Pages Plus model. First of all, ASP is really the leading web development platform today. There are nearly 1 million ASP developers. And the thing that's made it so popular is that it's a simple and approachable model of application development. You know, you just take some HTML pages, you put some embedded script code in there, you save it to the file system, and get dynamic pages. And it's flexible. You can generate things like WML, you can generate XML. You can even use it to generate things like binary images. So it's pretty flexible and extensible. It also supports multiple languages. So you can use things like JScript, you can use VB script, you can use things like Perl script. There have been a number of vendors who have announced other scripting languages that can be plugged into ASP. So it's been flexible from the language standpoint. And it also allowed you to extend the functionality by using COM objects. So you can create business objects or use things like ADO to enhance the functionality of your apps. You don't have to write everything in script. Now the next slide, the bad and the ugly. While ASP code is really very, very simple to write and fundamentally simple in the concepts, it tends to get messy. You know, when you look at these pages, especially when you've got inline script generating client script, can become almost mind-boggling to try and read. And it's very non-structured, right? So code tends to move all over the page, and it becomes fairly difficult to read. It also requires, I believe, too much code. So there's no way in ASP to avoid writing code and having dynamic behavior. If you have, for example, an add rotator, a control that you built, or a component rather, that you built in C++ or VB, you can't just sort of plop it onto the page and use it. You always have to write some code to activate it. And that means that to do any simple thing, you've got to be really a programmer. And HTML, just plain HTML, has really allowed a lot of non-programmers to use it because it's declarative in its nature. Another thing that's a huge problem is the fact that the code and the content have to be mixed together in ASP. And this means that when you've got designers and developers who are sort of building a single page, you've got the developer doing the business logic and you know, perhaps some of the formatting, and you've got a designer who's making it really look good. The fact that they're both contending over this one file can be a problem. I know that a lot of people, you know, your designers might use a Mac that might not recognize the ASP code, and you know, if you give it to them and it comes back even reformatted, it could cause a lot of problems. So while ASP is flexible in terms of the languages it supports. There's one big caveat, which is that it has to be a script language, because it doesn't really have a compilation module. You support this active scripting interface, and you run sort of in an interpreted mode. And as a result, script languages are frequently loosely typed. They're not strongly typed. And it's interpreted, so it doesn't compile and you don't get the efficiencies of compilation. Now, deploying an ASP page is pretty simple, right? I mentioned that before. You just type some code in and you save it to the file system and good to go. If your site is running, you can make changes and save it and, you know, it'll recompile them and pick it up. If, however, you're using components, it's a different story. Components need to register on the server because COM and DCOM and COM Plus require registration. And furthermore, DLLs get locked. So that if your application is actually running, you've got to go onto the server, shut it down, deploy the component, and restart it. And that can be a real problem. Another thing that we've heard a lot from customers is that they love the concept of session state. In fact, would like to use it more. They'd like to, you know, maybe use it at the ISAPI level of programming. But the thing that they have a real problem with is that it's limited to a single machine. So if you have a web farm and you've got multiple machines running the same application and a user comes in and hits machine A and comes back and hits machine C, their session is lost, because the session is actually running in the ASP process. So those are some of the things that we looked at in terms of creating ASP Plus and saying, you know, there are lots of things that we like, and there are lots of things that we've recognized and customers have recognized that we should really try and address. And so that's what we've done. That we're introducing at this PDC ASP Plus, which is really a complete platform for building, deploying, and running web applications. And we've really done a tremendous amount of work. It's a completely rewritten product, completely re-architectured. Some of the top-level points are, number one, it has a much more simple and powerful page programming model. So if you're doing HTML pages, it's dramatically simpler, it's dramatically more powerful. It also supports compiled languages. So if you saw my general session yesterday, I was showing both Visual Basic, which was compiled, and C#, which was also compiled. And I believe you saw COBOL this morning, which is also compiled. And it supports all languages that can target the common language runtime. So it's not just limited to the Microsoft languages, but there are a number of vendors who are creating really very interesting languages that can be plugged into ASP+. It's also completely factored architecture. So you can get in at multiple levels of the system and plug in and extend it, replace pieces, create your own programming abstractions on top of it. So we haven't made it so that there's a single model that you have to develop to. It's really very, very flexible. We've done a lot to improve deployment, both for the pages, the components, for the configuration information, all the stuff that you would typically have to register or shut down your web server for. We've also done a tremendous amount to improve the performance and the scalability and the availability. So we've done a lot of work to make it so that your app is going to keep running, that it's going to be scalable in both web farms and on multi-proc machines, so that when you deploy this, you'll know that you'll be able to keep up with customer demand. And lastly, but certainly not least, we've designed it from the ground up to have great support for design tools. So we've really worked very closely with the Visual Studio team to make sure that we built something that satisfies what I see as two different types of developers. Number one is the guy who's using Notepad or GNU Emacs or whatever tool you want to use, right? You should be able to just start typing in the code and completely understand it. Number two, you need great tools that automate a lot of that for you. A lot of code that I was writing yesterday in my general session, it would really be really great if the tool provided a better interface so that you see those controls and set their properties, see how they look so that you tweak them visually and see what it's going to look like as you're developing the page. And so we have great WYSIWYG designer support. So here are the three major areas of the platform. There's pages, services, which are sort of the two major programming model abstractions that we've built into ASP+. And then beneath that is the application infrastructure. And I'll be going to each of these areas. So the ASP+ web pages. One thing that they do is they simplify development, and they provide you with a very, very familiar event-driven, control-based architecture for writing web applications. Well, one of the goals was to sort of do for web development what Visual Basic did for Windows development, which was to make it easy so that people could just have a very approachable tool, have very approachable, easy-to-use, reusable components. They could just sort of plop them on a page and get instant dynamic functionality. And that it was an object-oriented system so that you could extend it and write more complicated applications and really tame the development process because you've got a real architecture there. So the server controls are really one of the key aspects. They encapsulate complete functionality. So they encapsulate both rendering content to the browser and also, and just as importantly, interacting with any user postbacks that occur. So if you have a calendar control, for example, when the user's clicking on, to go forward or backward on a calendar control is the only one who has to know about that functionality. There's no code that you have to write to get that behavior to happen. Also importantly is that we've designed it from the ground up to support a wide range of devices. We made a very explicit design decision early on that users wanted to be able to support all browsers. And that meant, just simple HTML3.2. So we needed to create a rich model that allowed you to build applications that supported that model. At the same time, you really want a programming model that allows you to take more advantage of richer clients. And you want to be able to support a multitude of those clients, whether they're, rich HTML clients or simple WML phones. You want them to be able to adapt to those automatically. Another key thing is that we wanted to allow you to separate the code from the content. Now, in my demo session yesterday, when I was building that application, I was building it all in one file. Because for a lot of people, if you are the GNU Emacs programmer and you're just typing stuff in, you don't want to have to edit multiple files simultaneously. And being able to have everything in one file is, for a lot of ASP programmers, a very important thing to maintain. At the same time, you do want to be able to separate it out so that your code is completely separated. It's in a separate file from the HTML design and sort of the template. And this allows developers and designers to work together. There's, as I mentioned in my general session yesterday, sort of two variations of the separation. One is where you sort of deploy it and you sort of link the code in, and ASP Plus compiles it dynamically on the server. And the other is that you actually compile a DLL and simply deploy the DLL so your code never gets put on the web server. So another key thing is that we want to support all languages. So ASP Plus supports early bound compiled languages. So whether it's Visual Basic.NET, C#, Managed C++, COBOL, there are a lot of languages that people are doing. All of them are rich compiled languages. And ASP Plus supports them. So when you're running ASP Plus, you're getting that on-demand compile. So it compiles once into a DLL that is then loaded and run. So it'll only be compiled once. If you restart the machine or restart the web server, it's not recompiled every time. It's not recompiled on every hit. It's only compiled the first time. And so we've managed to, with this architecture, create a very high-performance platform in that it's compiled, yet still retain the very, very simple ASP programming model where you just, you write some code in a file or the separate file, you save it, and you hit it with the web browser, and you see your results. And again, the ASP Plus pages have been designed from the ground for great WYSIWYG tool support. So the controls. Controls are are sometimes difficult for people to understand. They are objects that are instantiated. They run on the server. So there's no code that needs to get sent down to the clients. They run on the server. They're specified in the source code with an attribute that says run it equals server. And some very, very angry people came up to me yesterday and told me that I need quotes around server for full HTML and XML compliance. And they're actually right, so it should actually be run it quote server. But you can use this shorthand. We accept that too. The browser never sees this, nor does an XML parser, because when we instantiate those controls, that's really an indication to the ASP Plus compiler to say that for this region, for like this data list, we need to instantiate a control, and it's going to be the thing that handles the render. So it handles whatever HTML or reference to an object tag, etc., that gets sent down to the client. So it's responsible for the rendering, and then handling the postbacks. And there's a whole architecture so that if I click on a link in a calendar control, for example, when it flows back to the page, that the request actually percolates down and finds the calendar control which knows how to handle it. So this allows the controls to directly handle the postback event, the postbacks that come from the client. And then they can raise events so that you can interact with them in user code. So once the control handles it, it's going to fire an event. So, for example, a calendar control would say date click, and it would expose a on date click event that you could hook up to. And so you could write a little bit of server-side code that says, when the user clicks on the day, I would like to do something, like maybe go fetch their itinerary. So it gives you a very, very simple, easy to understand, familiar, event-driven programming model. The controls themselves are fully declarative, which means that there are a set of methods that they can expose that allow them to be automatically activated on the page. So there's like an init method that they can expose to get initialized. There is a page load event. There is a render event, etc. So they can fully hook into the page processing and cooperate in multi-pass execution scheme so that a control can hook in, and when it gets to run, it's actually independent of where it is on the HTML page. Now, what the fully declarative controls allow you to do is they allow you to not have code for very, very common scenarios. So some of you might have seen the validation controls that I demoed yesterday, or the data list, which has been shown in a number of demos. So really, I didn't have to write any code to get them to do their thing. I just plop them down on the page, and they're automatically activated because they hook into the methods that the page calls on its controls. If you saw my general session yesterday, I covered the concept of templates. And what templates are properties that a control can expose. And a control can expose as many properties, template properties, as it likes, that allow the user to pass in customized behavior for how the control renders and how it processes the input. And so it allows you to take something like a data list and completely control its look and feel. And we have a number of applications. If you check out the iBuySpy application at www.ibuyspy.com, you can see the use of these server controls with the customized look and feel. So we use them all over the place, whether it's displaying a menu that's just sort of a little list with some interesting styles, or these product listings that maybe display multiple items wrapped on a single line and then sort of wrap, so you've got multiple columns. The templates are really the things that allow you to do this. And an important part of this is that controls can be nested. So I can pass in, if I've got a list, I can pass in button controls and specify handlers, and when the list replicates, I can have controls inside those. So it's completely hierarchical. And that's very, very powerful, and something that we haven't really had for example, on the Windows platform. You can't typically take a table and pass in some buttons and some other controls and actually get the events. A single control can also handle multiple client devices with built-in browser cap capabilities in ASP+, so they're always available. And they're much, much more powerful. This is a little aside. The .NET frameworks has a number of very, very useful classes that you can use, and one of the classes is a set of regular expression classes. And these allow you to do actually full Perl 5, I believe, compatible regular expressions with some enhancements. And we use those in the browser cap to provide much more flexible browser detection, because you can specify very powerful regular expressions, not just matching against, nav1 or nav2 or something like that. And the controls can use these to understand how to render themselves for different devices. Now, yesterday I showed you some mobile controls, and the mobile controls, for example, can render for HTML devices. So they can render content for a Palm 5 or a Pocket PC. They can also understand a phone that expects WML. And they can, based on those client capabilities, render different content. I also showed some controls that can render rich DHTML or down-level HTML3.2 without a change in the code that you have to write. So they can completely encapsulate the behavior from multiple devices. And the code that you write does not need to change. Thank you. So on to web services. So that's sort of an overview of the pages. And again, I'm going to be giving a high-level overview, and I'll be talking at the end about some of the talks where you can go for real drill down into the various components of ASP+. So web services, all of the web services that you saw were really built on top of ASP+. It provides a very simple model for creating these web services. There's a new type of file. So the ASP+ pages that you build HTML pages in have a file extension of ASPX. And the reason we changed the file name from ASP is so that when you install this on a system, it has zero impact on your existing ASP+, on your existing ASP applications. And so you can install it and not worry because it doesn't interfere at all with ASP. That same engine that is running applications keeps running them. Now, there's a new type of file in ASP+ that has the extension ASMX. And that's what allows you to simply build web services. And instead of being sort of an HTML-centric page, it's a code-centric page. So what you do is you simply write a class in this file, or you can provide a link to a DLL or another file that contains your code. And we will on-demand compile that and generate the contract. Now, SDL, it says SDL contract on the screen. That's now SCL. We've been in the process of revising this and working with a number of partners. And SDL was sort of the predecessor. It's actually an SCL contract. And it also exposes that HTML information page that you probably saw in a bunch of the demos. Now, as I mentioned during those demos, you can customize that page. So that's just the page that we ship. It's actually an ASPX, it's an ASP Plus page. You can get in there and write your own. You can put your own look and feel on it. And you can also completely replace it. So you can imagine that you might have a web service where you didn't want a help page. You didn't want people to really be able to discover it. Maybe you would sell them some software and it's the thing that talks back to your web service. So you can actually completely suppress that. Now, when we dynamically compile that class, incoming HTTP requests are automatically mapped into method calls on the class. And again, you write it just as a simple class. You're not really thinking about HTTP or XML. You think about the fact that I want to write a get products method that takes in a string, maybe a category, maybe some other parameters. integers. They can be complex data types. They're not actually limited to simple data types. And we will map those into the types in the common language runtime. So you get the RIT types. You just think of it as handling a method call. And it supports multiple message formats on the wire. So we support, for example, an HTTP GET request. So you can just pass in the parameters on the query string, for example. You can also use a form post. It also supports SOAP, which, if you've there are I believe a number of sessions that talk about SOAP. But SOAP is a way of describing headers and wrapping XML in an XML envelope. And another thing that I don't actually have down here, but we support, is defining your own schema. While we anticipate that a lot of people will be using SOAP, we also recognize that the internet is, a great big open place where a lot of people will be coming up with their own schema, and it's very, very important that you be able to, easily and simply get in there and handle those schemas. So you can handle any schemas. And I assume that, comma separated values becomes the next wave on the internet. You can plug in support for that too. But I think a lot of it is going to revolve around XML and different types of schemas. So that's a scenario that we've really tried to handle very well as well. So the underlying application infrastructure. Now this is the piece that we haven't really talked about at all in any of the general sessions. But the pages and the services, everything built on top, share a single application model. So you've got session and application state. It's actually extensible state. And that's shared between your pages and your services. So if you write a web service, you can actually get access to session state. There's a whole configuration and administration model, which is completely refactored from how we used to do configuration on IIS. Code deployment is common between services. So you can copy those DLLs and they'll be unlocked for both pages and services. And again, we've completely refactored the architecture so that you can plug in at a number of levels. And so we've got HTTP handlers, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a bit, and modules for fine-grained control. So some of the key improvements are really that we've enhanced the deployment, the scalability, and the availability of your applications. And we provide ways to do flexible scenarios such as authentication, so you can use a variety of authentication schemes. Now, deployment. AS Plus supports what we call X-copy deployment. And really can substitute something like FTP deployment, anything where you don't have to run any code on the server. It's just, if you can get the bits onto the machine, that's all you need to get your application deployed. We've really tried to make it so that no registration is required. You never have to stop the web server. And that it supports all the web resources, whether it's pages, services, compiled components, or configuration information. So code deployment. There is a directory that an application can have which has all of your components. And by default, we put it in a directory called bin. And we map it so that code cannot be downloaded from that directory. So you can put components there and you don't have to worry that somebody's going to download them. Simply by placing them in that directory is enough to have them available for your application. And each application is isolated from other applications. So the components that you deploy there are private. No one else can see them. So there's, if you're hosting and you have Coke and Pepsi on the same machine, each of them can deploy sensitive components and not worry that anybody else is going to see them, because the only one who can instantiate them is the code running in that particular application. Now, you can also use different versions of control. So the common language runtime supports very, very tight binding, very tight and flexible binding. Now, in the directory, you can, one application, for example, you could deploy all of the controls, all of the business logic components even system components, and just load whatever in that directory. You can also specify, using tight name binding, the exact version component. So if there are shared components that you rely on a machine, you can automatically bind to those. So that you can have, even within the same project, even within the same process, rather, multiple versions of the same component. So it's very, very flexible in terms of versioning. Now, one of the things I want to stress is that we didn't simply plaster over the GUI that was there before, right? So it's not like when you copy deploy, we somehow detect this and we go to the registry and we register everything and we create all these entries everywhere. There's nothing anywhere, right? So you just delete that directory and it's gone. For a lot of people, I think this sounds like Back to the Future, because this is we used to build applications, right? You just had a directory, you copy your stuff in there, and that's all it was. And things like registration, while they've had great benefits, can be difficult to manage. So this is much, much simpler. Now, dynamic code updating. So what happens when you actually copy a DLL there? Well, what we do is, number one, the DLLs are not locked, right? So when we load the code from the DLL, we basically load it, and we actually shadow copy it into sort of a cache, and we load it from there so that when you can simply copy over the new one, and we'll be able to load it in the new application. And what we do is we detect the fact that you have upgraded the component, and we actually gracefully migrate the app while it's running from the old version to the new version. So if you've got an app and it's on an incredibly busy server, we're going to allow it to continue to process the request that it's already in the process of processing. We're also going to spin up a new app that uses the new component. And we're going to route all new requests for that application to that new instance of the app. When the old version is done, we'll then shut it down. And so the result is that you as a developer or as an administrator simply know about deploying the application. And the users just notice that the application is automatically upgraded. They don't have to think about it. You don't have to shut anything down. You don't have to reboot. It just works. It works very nicely and gracefully. So configuration information. We now have an XML-based configuration system that's very, very rich, and it's extensible. And it allows you to hierarchically apply configuration settings to the entire application. The configuration information is stored within the directories of the application. So today, you have the IS metabase, and if you register an application, you've got to programmatically add settings to the metabase using the IS administration objects or using MMC manually. And it means that there's no way to deploy your app and have configuration information without going in and doing some other work. Additionally, the metabase is not really designed to allow you to easily add your own properties. And we've done a lot of work to make this an extensible system, so you can actually define custom configuration handlers. And what a configuration handler is an object that processes a region of the XML configuration file. So it can create configuration objects that your application can use. So we use this for things like defining the handlers that map to individual classes. Right? So you can say, when I see a URL that looks like this, instantiate this control. Now, to do the configuration for that, you have sort of imperative verbs that you would have to say, add a new handler. And the configuration handler is the thing that reads that configuration information and builds its internal data structure to provide you programmatic interface to that. There's also sort of a predefined bag-like thing called application data. And that allows you to just put in your own settings, whatever they are. So you can imagine, for example, that you're doing some data access in an application. And you want to specify the name of database and other information in the configuration file and not in the code. Well, you would simply add it to the application settings, and then there's an object within your code that you can say, get configuration settings. It's actually a hash table interface, and fetch me my DSN setting, and then use that. So it allows you to separate out the configuration information in a very flexible way. Now again, it's hierarchical. So it actually starts at the machine level, and there's a configuration file for that. There are configuration files for the sites, for virtual routes. For every directory, you can have a configuration file. And when we get a URL, we instantiate the objects that represent that and then give you an interface to fetch the configuration information. So it's fully hierarchical and very, very flexible. Here's a sample of a configuration file. So it's very, very simple XML-based configuration. And you can see it's wrapped in a configuration block. And here, for example, how we specify those handlers. So that HTTP handler tag is handled by a configuration factory. We'll go and read the add, for ASP files, instantiate the page factory. You see default.aspx, it's the start page, etc. Here we have some custom configuration information. So you can, as a control vendor, or someone who's developing controls, you can develop a control that also includes a configuration handler and say, the add rotator supports the following rich configuration information. Now, in the version of ASP Plus that you're getting today, it's schemaless. In one of the coming betas, we're going to be adding in schemas optionally so that you can use rich design tools and have it strongly typed, but it also allows you to work sort of in a looser, untyped fashion as well. So improved scalability. This is really one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing. So Session State now supports web farms, so that applications are no longer tied to a single machine, nor are they tied to a single process. So even if you're only running a single machine, you can run the ASP Plus state server, which is a separate process. And your application processes can run and put and retrieve the session state from that server. We also support multiple session state providers. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the modules. But basically, again, ASP Plus is a completely factored system. So all of the facilities are things that you can replace. And so session state, the thing that provides session state, the thing that goes out and talks to the session state server, or the thing that goes out to talk to a SQL server, is actually a replaceable module. We wrote a couple of those modules. If you got ASP Plus and you said, boy, these guys are still out to lunch, this session state is really bad, I could write a better one myself, you're free to do it, right? You can just go in, write your own module, it's completely documented, and it'll feel as built-in as the one we did. So we've written two of them. We wrote an ASP Plus state server, and this is a very, very lightweight, in-memory database that doesn't have query capabilities, is simply designed for maintaining session state. It is designed to do all of the timeout code and aging logic. It runs in a separate process from IIS. So if your web server crashes, if you restart it, etc., your state is still going to be maintained. Now, a lot of people have also told us, why don't we just store state in a database? And so we thought that would be a pretty cool thing. So what we did was we wrote another provider that stores the session state in SQL Server. So you can have a SQL Server where that's where all of your state is. So if you want to have the backup capabilities or the fault tolerance that SQL Server offers, you can easily do that. And again, if you want to write your own, you're free to do that. Now, we've also built it to be scalable on multi-proc machines. We've spent a lot of time working on just the core architecture, the core runtime in a single process to be very scalable. But we also have sort of a strangely named technique that we call web gardens that run a single instance of an app in multiple processes. And so it sort of takes the idea of a web arm but does it on a single machine. And the reason that that can be valuable is what we do is, let's say you're running on a 4-proc box. We will instantiate 4 different processes, all running the same application, and bind each of them to a single processor. And what that allows is that you're never going to get locks within that process that span processors. So we've done a lot to make sure that you don't have blocking code. And actually the .NET, the common language runtime has some very cool primitives for doing multi-threaded code. So it has the ability to sort of say this object is synchronized, but also has things like increment operations that you can use for synchronization without actually blocking anybody. So it's very, very efficient. So we've done a lot of work for that, but Web Garden, especially when you get 4- and 8-way systems, can really help increase the scalability. And it's optional. By default, everything runs in single process, but you can, for the advanced user, the advanced developer, you can configure ASP Plus so that it uses this technique and make sure that your application runs okay. Now, in order to do Web Gardens, you need to use the out-of-proc session state. You need to use the session state server either on another machine or on that machine, so that when a request comes in, it might go to any one of the processors, any one of the processes, and it needs to be able to get its session state. Now, one last thing I should say about this session state is that it is partitionable. Session state is inherently a partitionable problem, and so if you have a web arm, you're not limited to running one copy of SQL Server or one copy of the ASP server. You can run multiple of them, and we can hash to say, for user 1, it's stored on server 1, and for user 3, it's stored on server 3. And so you can partition both the machines running your application logic, and you can also partition across session state. So if you need to scale up in any dimension, it's very, very easy to do that. We've also built in caching support. One of the best ways to make your dynamic content faster is not really make it dynamic. For a lot of things, you can cache the results of either your computations or your output. And so we have a lot of caching support built into ASP+. For one, we have full-page output caching. So you can just add a tag to your page that says, I'd like this thing to be cached, and here's the timeout period. Or it depends on this file. Or, there are a number of different policies that you can specify. You can vary it by parameters to the page or language or user agent. So you can say, for example, I'd like this page, I'm going to generate multiple languages from this page, and I'd like each of those to be a unique cache element. But other than that, you can use it across requests. And with caching of the French page, if I hit the application wearing my translator mustache while I was speaking Arabic, I would get an Arabic page, and that could be cached. And so we have very flexible full-page out caching. We also have the ability to cache pieces of the page. And this allows the same flexibility, but allows you to cache just components of the page, so little pieces of the page. Now, you can also cache. There are ways to correspond the data that you compute for that piece of the page with that little fragment. This is not implemented in the version you have, the fragment caching. So the full page output caching is in there. The fragment caching will be coming in a later beta. We also have extensive cache API, so that, again, we've completely componentized the entire system, so that if you're a developer who's built, for example, business logic components or some other type of component, you can use this cache API to cache arbitrary objects. And you can, for example, say, let's imagine a scenario where you've got a file on disk that contains like zip codes or something like that. And you're going to read that in your application, and you want to keep that thing cached. The only time you really want to throw it out is if you update the file. What you can do is you can say, in your control, in the component that you are accessing this from, you would say, let me try and read from the cache. If not, let me read it from the file and put it in the cache. And I'll tell the cache to keep an eye on that file and invalidate it if it sees the file change. This is incredibly flexible because you can also imagine other scenarios where you've got a database and you've got tables and you have a trigger that fires when the table changes, and you sort of can touch a file on disk and automatically invalidate the cache, so you can build up very nice data cache with this. You can, of course, also say things like, I'd like to keep this object for an hour. Maybe I want to go out and fetch something from a site, from maybe a web service once an hour, and then keep it cached. We built an application which I believe is in the Quick Start. So if you look at the ASP Plus Quick Start that you got with the .NET Framework SDK, there's an application which is a little portal app. And one of the modules that we built for the office goes to Slashdot, which exposes all of their stories as XML. And once an hour, it goes and fetches all the stories. So in our portal, we can see, what's happening on Slashdot. What are the latest headlines? We then take it, we format it into HTML, and that's how we display it. So that's an example of using sort of a pre-existing web service and the caching APIs to make it more efficient. Authentication. So in previous versions of IIS supports basic digest and NTLM authentication, and it goes against either Active Directory or the NT Security Access Manager. And that's how it validates the credentials. And we've heard from a lot of people that, if building a huge site, or you might have scenarios where you already have the list in some database, you'd really like to be able to validate the users for, against that database and not use NT's mechanisms. So what we've done is we've built in a very, very flexible authentication system that, number one, continues to handle basic digest and NTLM authentication. And for that, it continues to leverage NT-SAM. So if you're using it in an intranet scenario, it works perfectly against your NT users. Like session state, however, security is sort of a pluggable module. And so we have a passport module that allows you to sort of simply by setting in the configuration information, use passport, allows you to use the passport profile APIs to integrate passport into your application. And we've also created a very, very easy to use custom form-based authentication scheme that allows you to simply plug in your authentication routine, go against whatever system you want. So you could go, maybe you've got everything stored in SQL Server or an Oracle database or DB2 or something like that. You can just, get called, go against those databases, give us the token to remember, and we'll encrypt that and pass back and forth with cookies. And you can then get access to those, many of the pages or web service handler that you write. It allows you, in those instances, to create really nice custom login pages. So if you go check out that iBuySpy application, you'll notice that when you log in, it uses a very, very cool little authentication page that's completely branded for iBuySpy. It's not a little gray pop-up dialog. And that's using the custom forms-based authentication. And I would really encourage you, if you're interested in Active Server Pages Plus, to take a look at that iBuySpy application, because it really does a great job of walking you through all of the code, all of the store procedures, all of the business objects, all of the ASP Plus code that created that application. And it walks you through their security architecture, which has, a very nice branded login page. It has a SQL database that is storing all of the user information. So you can plug in whatever custom authentication scheme you want. Authorization. So once you've authenticated somebody, we support the notion of users, and we all support the notion of roles. And what roles do is they map sets of users, sets of identities into sort of buckets that are logical groups that describe capabilities. So, for example, you could map within your organization different levels of employees. You might have the president, you might have a manager, you might have a clerk or whatever. And you can use those logical names. What it does is it allows you as a developer to specify security in a logical way rather than a physical way. Now, you can, if you do forms-based auth, for example, you can plug in your own role. So you can say, I'm going to add, here's the user, and he's part of this sort of role set. You can also then apply that to the pages, and you can also use it programmatically to check within your code to say, is the user in this role? And the user object is made available to you by ASP+. And if you're writing lower level code, it's part of the HTTP context. So you can easily get this from any of the objects that you write, so you can do checks. Now, as I've talked a little bit about, ASP+ is a completely well-factored architecture. It's very layered. You can hook in at various levels. So, for example, modules are little components that plug into the processing that happens before the request gets to sort of its endpoint. So before it gets to the page or the web service, there are these modules that execute. For example, that's how we plug in new version session state. Session state is a module that executes so that when the request comes in, we determine who's going to get it. We execute the different modules, and each of them gets to add something to context. So the session state module gets to go and see, has a session been started? If not, let me go out to the database, go out to the state server, and start the module. Let me set the cookie. Let me make that session state available. You can add your own parts of state, right? So let's imagine that you want to add user state, and you wanted that to always be available. You could write a module that goes out to a database and finds out information about the particular user and makes that available for a page. The user of the page would then never have to worry about going and fetching that information. All they would do is they would use it, and it would always be available. One of the chief things about these modules is that they're asynchronous. So using the underlying asynchronous mechanisms in NT, you can, for example, get called in your session state module. You can issue a synchronous request to the database to say, go fetch me my session state. And maybe that's locked by a session being used on another machine. You can reply back to the runtime, I've done an asynchronous call, and when the result comes back, I'd like you to resume my processing. We can then completely free up that thread and allow your server to keep going. So you can use these to build very, very high performance mechanisms that extend the system. And that's the modules. You can also do things such as content filtering. And I was talking to, last night we had an event for the people who have been early adopters of ASP+, and that's sort of the set of vendors, and control vendors, and people who've been working with it in its sort of pre-alpha form. So they've really gone through a lot. And I spoke to the guys from Stingray Software, and they said, wow, we really love ASP Plus, and we're using it in ways that you never imagined. We built this internet dispatcher, which is taking in XML packets, translating them in Corba into SAP, integrating all of these different systems, and it's fantastic. And I said, well, that's exactly, we didn't know that particular scenario, but we knew that we wanted to allow people to innovate in what we couldn't imagine. That scenario is completely something that we'd like everybody to do. Go off, hook in at any of the levels and add whatever functionality you want. And they said a very interesting thing was that they went to Sapphire, which is the SAP conference, a couple of weeks ago, and SAP needed a way to support all of the mobile devices so that people could walk around and, whether they were using a WAP phone or a Palm 7 or something like that, that they could actually get access to the SAP information. And so they used Stingray to help them bridge all of those different systems. And people came up to them and said, wow, this is amazing. How did you guys write this? And they said, we can't talk about it. And the reason they didn't talk about it was completely written in C# using ASP+, and they never had any crashes, never had any problems. And they said, this stuff is working today, it's really amazing. So I would encourage you, if you want to find out more about sort of that low-level processing, stop by the Stingray booth and, talk to the guys there. They're really, really very nice, and they'll, give you, as sort of a nonpartisan user of this technology, sort of a testimonial as to how cool it is. HTTP handlers are sort of the next level. So all of the programming model abstractions that were built into ASP+, such as the web services and the pages, are actually implementing a low-level interface called iHTTP handler. And this is something that you can implement too. And what it allows you to do is build an object that implements this interface that gets activated when a particular URL is called. So you could imagine, for example, building a dynamic JPEG generator. And it's not really a web service in that it's not returning XML, right? You don't want your images encapsulated into, base64 encoded or something and wrapped in XML. You just want to ship the, the binary bits down. So what you could do is you could simply write an object that implements ICP handler, and that would be called directly. To a degree, it is similar to ISAPI level programming, except you get all of the really nice ASP Plus intrinsics. You get the request, you get the response, you get all the configuration information, you get all of that cool stuff, but there's no programming model abstraction. You're completely in control. And so, things like an image generator or other, binary type of things, you can implement. And again, all the other abstraction layers of the page programming and the web service programming have been implemented on top of this implementation. So ASP has also been designed to improve availability. And I have down on a slide that it handles failures in user code. We basically designed it with the assumption that errors can always happen. And I'll tell sort of a funny little story. We've been working actually on ASP Plus for 2.5 years. We started in November of 1997. And we had all of these great things, these great ideas of what we would build. And internally at Microsoft, we would do shows that presented this. And the way we presented this slide during, I assure you, only one presentation was we had a slide that its title was ASP Plus, Designed for Failure. And what we meant by that was that it was designed to gracefully handle failure, but when you read it, it sounds like, we're designing it to put ourselves out of a job, go on welfare or something like that. But we designed it with the assumption that error can always happen. Even though we have this great, common language runtime, which can, verify code and make sure that you don't do things. If you access past an array boundary, it throws an exception. If you try and access a null reference, it throws an exception. So it's very, very robust. But we said stuff can always happen, and we should be able to recover from that. So what we did was we built a high-performance, out-of-proc application model. It's actually not using the IS proc application model. It's using a different one that was designed. It is very, very high performance, and it can do a bunch of things that the IS one can't do. It can, first of all, detect access violations, which the IS one can do. So if the process crashes, it will gracefully recover from that. However, you can also configure, say, if I get to like 100 megabytes of working set, I bet there's a memory leak in there. And even as a garbage collected system, you could have, for example, a static variable. And you could, assign an object and forget to do something. You could have something that calls native code and manages that memory. And so you could have memory leaks. And so the application, that process model, can detect those things and say, boy, that process has grown out of control. It's gone past where they told me to do something about it. And so I'll shut it down. If there are deadlocks, if the thing just becomes unresponsive after a time, we can recover from that. It also supports preemptive cycling. So you talk to a lot of people who say, well, every once in a while I just reboot my machine because I like to keep things clean, just clean out memory. And so we allow you to sort of the same thing, but much less heavyweight. And that is to sort of every hour, every 2 hours, maybe once a day, once a week, once a month, shut down the application and restart it, just to make things all fresh and new. Now, the way we shut down and cycle the apps and recover from any of these problems is very similar to how we upgrade the apps. What we do is we don't sort of blow away the app and fire up a new one, because that would allow requests to back up. If we detect any one of these problems, what we do is we spin up a new instance of the app, and we allow this guy to, sort of calm down. See if it comes back. So we start redirecting new requests to this thing, allow this to finish. We actually, I believe, keep track of the queued requests that have never been finished, and we can pass those to the new application instance if this guy crashes or we have to blow it away. If it's unresponsive after a time, we will actually aggressively terminate it with extreme prejudice. So we'll just get rid of it. And the result is, again, that the user of the application, your customers, should never see the application go down. And it's one of the things that really allows us to, even at this early stage of development, because what you're getting is a preview release. The data will be coming in a little while to deploy on the internet, because we have very, very good availability. So in summary, we really believe ASP Plus provides a quantum leap in the power and the ease of use and the flexibility. It's a great architecture for building web pages, both for reach clients and rich clients, and supporting multiple devices. And a key aspect is that it allows you to build web services incredibly easy, and it allows you to consume them as well. It also allows you to build anything you want, right? You can get in there, and if you want to do an image generator, you just want to do some new binary RPC mechanism over the web, you can do that too. Factored architecture puts you in control, and if you want to create things like a new state server or something, new types of state or new facilities that you want to use, you can do that. We've also designed it from the ground up to be very scalable and available. Now, we haven't released performance numbers, but we have been comparing it against a lot of technologies, and it's been doing quite well. So I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the performance and the scalability. And by allowing you to easily build these web services, it's really going to enable this new breed application. It allows you to easily get web services and build richer apps, do richer UI, and make everything much, much richer for the applications that you build. Now, in closing, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the cool sessions that we have. So we've got introducing ASP Web Forms. So Web Forms is how it's sort of exposed in Visual Studio. That's the pages. And it's actually really drills down into them in depth. And so there are 2 sessions devoted to that. And that concentrates on that area. We also have 2 sessions on building server controls. Now, you can build your own server controls, that plug into VS, that give you that drag and drop. And the developers of ASP Plus are going to walk you through all of the interfaces, how to plug into the designers, how to do really cool stuff. There are a number of techniques that you can use for building those controls. You can even take individual pages and just say that they're a control. Every page compiles down to a control. So there are a number of techniques that you can use. There's also building and using ASP Plus with web services, targeting mobile devices. This will walk you through that set of controls, how to use the performance and caching, and that low-level HTTP runtime is things like the modules and the HTTP handlers. So it's going to really drill down to the lowest levels of ASP Plus. There's also one on building the offline applications. I didn't talk about it here, but I showed that to you yesterday, which is that ASP Plus can be hosted in a variety of environments. We host it on the web server. We can host it within the browser directly, so you can run the same code within the browser and build offline applications. It also talks on how to migrate ASP to ASP Plus, because there are some changes that you should be aware of, and how to do things like ASP security. The IE guys are going to show you how to build controls that take explicit advantage of rich client facilities in server controls. And we've also built in localization. So ASP applications are very, very easy to localize. And I would also check out the data track, because XML, as I mentioned yesterday, is built into the system. And we have a great new data story and data binding architecture, so you should check that out as well. So with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you very much. And I think we have microphones here if anyone has any questions. Okay, so there are actually microphones, but I will repeat the question, because there's a gentleman who stepped up here. So the question was, is session state server failoverable? And the answer is no. In the version of ASP Plus that we're shipping, version 1.0, the ASP state server does not automatic failover for fault tolerance. SQL Server does, so you can use that, and of course you could write your own. It's definitely a feature that we're looking at, but it's not in the version 1 product, base product. So the question is, what servers is this going to run? Is it going to be IS6? And no, it's going to run on Windows 2000. The plan is also to allow it to run on NT4 as well, although the preview release that you're getting runs on Windows 2000. It does not require a different version of IIS, so you can run it, again, on the existing Windows 2000 product that you have. So why don't we start over there?
You mentioned that you had that a page would be compiled on demand. Does that mean that you have to have the compilers for all the different languages on the server?
So the question is, I mentioned that the pages are compiled on demand. Does that mean you have to have all the compiles? And the answer is yes. Much like with ASP, you have compilers for the script languages. Now, if you're using Visual Studio, you can pre-compile everything on the client, just deploy the compiled DLLs, and then we don't, actually, I take that back. We would always need a compiler. However, you don't have to buy Visual Studio to get the compilers. It actually comes as part of the ASP Plus, as part of the .NET framework. So the compilers are part of it. If you use third-party languages, you'd have to deploy sort of the little command compilers. But it's sort of similar to ASP in that ASP had, VB script and JavaScript, and if you wanted Perl script, you had to install that on the server. But you don't need the full IDE, and you don't need to buy anything. It comes with the SDK.
Thank you.
I have two questions. First, how does ASP, in terms of performance, compare to a native ISAP extension?
So the question is, how does it compare in performance to an ISAP extension? And I actually can't answer that question. We don't have final numbers. We have done some tests where it, performs within just a couple of percent. Once we are done, again, we're not even at the beta. This is a preview release. So we don't have from pure native code, but the results have been very, very good. And when using things like the web gardens, you can actually, get, potentially even better performance, although I really can't say.
And the same question is, what is the underlying mechanism for keeping track of session state variables?
So the question is, what is the underlying mechanism? Well, the session state server has basically its own sort of in-memory database. When you use SQL Server, that's the thing that keeps track of it. There's actually one thing I forgot to mention. In terms of mapping session state into what's stored in the state server or the SQL server,
yes,
there are actually two mechanisms. One is a cookie, which is a session state cookie, and the other is we have built-in cookieless sessions so that we will automatically embed the session ID in the URL so that you don't have to have cookies. So if you're, in a country, for example, where cookies are illegal, you could use it without cookies, and that's built right in there. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could you review a couple of the pros and cons of using ASP to develop a web application versus when you want to go into a compiled component, your language of choice, say VB or C++?
So I guess what you mean is in ASP+, when would you put the logic in the page and when would you put the logic in a component?
Yeah, since you can access more and more of all these different levels you spoke about now, and it sounds like you can even access them directly from your compiled component.
Yeah, exactly. I would recommend, especially if you're doing stuff like business logic, accessing databases, you should wrap all of that functionality in a business object. And that's one of the reasons that we've spent so much time making it easy to deploy those components, because then you can also reuse those things later on for web services. If you've got reusable presentation that you'd like to have, that's great to build a control that runs in the page, which is sort of a step up. That's something that knows about ASP+, it knows about basically presentation. Business components are things that, you might run and you want APIs that you call into. And I would use the code in the ASP page to really deal with just the user interaction and sort of the UI level. So you should really use good 3-tier or N-tier design. Database logic is great to put in store procedures too. You get a lot of performance benefits. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What data types are supported in the session state server?
So the question is, what data types are supported in the session state server? Basically, the common language runtime supports serializable objects. So basically, if you're putting them in an out-of-proc or another machine, any type that can be serialized. So that's all of the intrinsic types, such as integers, longs, floats, strings, and then things like hash tables and other things that are serializable. Any of those you can store. Any objects that you can build business objects that are serializable too. And I've got just a minute and a half, and joining me on stage here for this final round of questions is Anders Heilsberg, the distinguished engineer, who's going to be doing a great talk on Introduction to C# after we're done.
I hope this question doesn't stray too far afield, but we're talking about the authorization and authentication capabilities. That seems really similar to what site server personalization and membership does right now. Can you comment briefly on the future or lack of future of that product? Or
I actually can't. I believe that site server in future versions is going to be targeting ASP+. But because of the time frames, they weren't able to target it for the new version. They'll probably be sitting on top of our stuff, adding more value. So it's just that some value has gone on top of our platform. But one of the key messages that you should have at ASP+ is it's a great platform for innovation. Right? You can really innovate in lots of new ways, and they'll be able to innovate, and you as developers will be able to innovate as well. Actually, we've got 20 seconds, so I think I'm not going to be able to take any more questions up here, but let me just take my mic off, and I'll meet you on the side of the stage, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. Thank you very much, those of you who are left from the previous talk, and Andrews will be talking to us.